12.11 was a massive patch, and even though this rundown is a couple of days late, we also have a micropatch adding even more changes. Now, as always, there's a TLDR at the end, so description down below, or if you want to go to a specific champion that you care about, those are also going to be timestamped. Now, let's talk about 12.11. As a bit of a preamble, I had recorded this the day of the patch. We are 3 days old on this rundown. Because there were audio issues, and my hour 40-minute long patch rundown was unusable, and I just did not have the energy to spend another hour and change re-recording one, and so I'm doing it now. But in dragging my heels, we managed to hit this after a micropatch, so it's still a useful patch rundown. Again, the micropatch updates are in the rundown, and for the most part, they've been covered. I did some of my work destructively, unfortunately, and that means some of the stuff was a bit too hard to reproduce, and I didn't spend infinite time and effort on the micropatch, but let's talk about what's going on here. So, first up, Kog'Maw got some changes. He also got a micropatch down. So we're going to be kind of scrolling through the spreadsheet, but ultimately, Kog'Maw W damage basically got brought up early and down late. This is actually still true in comparison. Well, okay, in the micropatch, it's just simply more damage. It is up early and down late compared to the old version. So here is pre-patch entirely to current version of Kog'Maw. He is a bit stronger as levels 1 through 4, and then he is weaker in the future. Now, if we Control F Kog'Maw and we do the rest of stuff, there were more changes to Kog'Maw in this patch. He lost some attack speed through his Q. He lost some armor MR shred through his Q, and then ultimately, this is the old data table for the strict nerf on the W damage, and this is still going to be roughly accurate in that he lost 5-ish% DPS early and about 8-ish% DPS late. Now, again, this data table would be this data table, and look, I'll tell you, let's be honest, we can do a little copy pasting down here, and if we Control F Kog'Maw yet again, we can come down right here and replace the numbers, and there. Okay, here's the actual difference in what's going on. Obviously, we can make these numbers green and make it look prettier, but here is the actual difference in the real world to actual Kog'Maw before and after the changes. He is still doing less damage. Obviously, at level 1, you don't actually have Q and W. Bear with me, it's an easier way to look at all these numbers. Ultimately, yes, Kog'Maw is still weaker than he was in 12.10, and even though technically early W damage is better than before the patch, everything else still matters here. There was a chance I got some of this incorrectly. Some of these numbers are slightly wrong. Doesn't matter, we're close enough to accurate, it's fine. All right, let's go back to the next set of changes, which is Olaf. Olaf got some nerfs, and then got some nerfs some more, because Olaf actually got buffs. And so here is Olaf in the actual patch. Again, we're kind of skipping back and forth. We'll cover it again when it goes on. But ultimately, Olaf got some less lifesteal. Even when he was a little bit higher on health, he got less lifesteal. However, he also, I believe, got more attack speed via the fact that his scaling got more generous. Again, we'll talk about it later. The big thing is that Olaf gained a lot of damage on his Q and a lower cooldown on his Q, which heavily increased the DPS of the ability. And so even though the W cooldown got nerfed later on, and the R bonus armor MR got nerfed later on, ultimately, Olaf literally gained damage, and so was a more powerful champion. He actually got buffed on the patch, and so they took off this armor reduction. Now, they took it down by 0 to 10%. Now, a really easy rule of thumb is to take a point of lethality or a point of percent armor reduction and roughly call either one 0.5% more damage, which means a 10% armor shred is roughly 5% more damage. Is it true in all cases? Of course not. But it's relatively accurate that it's like, yo, just tell me how big the change is. That's how big the change is. This is a roughly 0 to 5% less damage as a nerf. Provided you land Q, of course, but you're going to land Q. You're playing Olaf. You're not landing Q. You're not even auto-attacking, so like, all of his damage is based off the armor reduction. So Olaf lost 0 to 5% more damage. He also lost some extra shielding on the W because the missing health does not care about the rank of the ability. It's just there at all points in time. This is a much more felt change. Ultimately, this finally takes the Olaf changes from a buff to a nerf on the champion. These are both very, very big changes. And then we have Ryze. Ryze also got a big set of changes in the previous patch, but the primary one is now a micropatch buffing spell flux's damage very substantially, 0 to 20 base damage, and the AP ratio that was at 30% and became 35 in the patch now became 45 in the patch. Now, what's interesting is when I initially recorded this patch rundown, I was like, hey, you know, I think Ryze E should actually have a 45% AP ratio. I did a bunch of math around what the number should be for Ryze's abilities to make his ability power budget good, and then actually sent that to the design team. I wrote a Slack message. Now, a designer who's doing Ryze changes was independently also doing Ryze math. I just preempted him a little bit on this, and he's like, "Oh, it's helpful. Thanks very much." I'm not saying that I wrote this change, because I didn't. But he independently or cooperatively came to the exact same AP ratio that I wanted for Ryze E, and so I'm happy about that. So Ryze E now has an actually good and fair AP ratio. This is a very big AP ratio. Now, it's worth pointing out that Spell Flux only damages the first target hit. Now, keep in mind, Spell Flux is targeted, so it's still a pretty significant DPS increase. Yes, Overload is more of your damage, sure, whatever, but this is a very big DPS increase. I also really, 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 really like the base cooldown reduction on Overload, which allows Ryze to use his Q a bit more, not relying on the E and W resets, but just kind of getting to use Q overall. I actually like that quite a bit. So here is the difference as we scroll all the way back up on the spreadsheet. Here is Ryze's E damage. This is the overall set of changes comparing old 12.10 Ryze to new 12.11 Micropatch Ryze, and it is a very big damage buff on the E. Now these numbers are accounting for a assumed full build Ryze, so fully stacked Mana Flow, Mana Mythic, Seraphs, and 3 Biscuits. Obviously, you don't have all that mana at level 3. I know that, but I don't care to make some fake scaling of when the mana comes in. It's not important enough to me. The base damage changes isn't that big. And so ultimately, this is, the actual percent damage increase is actually bigger in the early game than you think. Because, as you get Seraphs online, as you finish stacking Mana Flow, as you eat your last biscuit, that's when that bit of mana comes in. Sure, whatever. Of course, mana cost change is still there. We can talk about that a bit later on when that goes down. But ultimately, yes, Ryze is quite a bit stronger. As a real quick TLDR, Kog'Maw went from too weak to now he's relatively strong. Kog'Maw is worth picking in the current patch. He is a fine champion. Olaf was definitely incredibly busted. He is now roughly balanced, though sadly not a great jungler, since these are pretty power neutral, not power neutral, but role agnostic nerfs. Armor reduction actually less important to jungling, since jungle monsters don't have much armor. They have very, very little. But technically is a damage reduction. And then the shielding, of course, can just be relevant overall. But all the PvP stuff still matters for a jungler. And so, again, Olaf is an overall weak jungler, an overall decent top laner to pretty strong. Kog'Maw is an overall decent bot laner to pretty strong. Ryze, as we all know, is never going to be playable in solo queue. I'm sorry, he's still dog shit. And then there's a big set of changes to Zeri. Now, this is the one that I didn't fully math out, and that's my bad. The scaling's 1 to 15 from levels 1 to 18 instead of 3 to 15, 1 to 13, which was, by the way, 1 to 12, I think. Levels 1 to 13, something like that. So let's talk about what's going on with Zeri. So Zeri's Q damage, this is, again, pre-micropatch, pre-everything 12.10 to post-micropatch Zeri. She does, in fact, deal more late-game damage. Less early lane bullying. The damage was higher before this micropatch here. It took a little bit, she was positive from level 1 onwards. Now it's level 5 onwards. Okay, fine. This is, again, it rounds to 100%, but technically a little bit higher at level 3, technically a little bit lower at level 4, not a big deal. Pretty whatever right there. The one thing I don't have here is the change in the passive charge damage. Again, my work in the earlier patch rundown was destructive. I didn't have the underlying numbers anymore. I didn't want to spend all the effort doing it. But point proven, this is definitely a damage down, and we can do a little bit of math when we go down to the Zeri changes overall. Also increases Spark Surge's cooldown by a flat 2 seconds. We can cover that one as well when needed. So now we can go into the big set of changes themselves. Bel'Veth, by the way, because I have the experience of about 3 days on the patch and 2 days with Bel'Veth in the game, she seems quite good. I think her day 1 win rate is around 45%, which is really high for a day 1 win rate. Bel'Veth is probably OP. I recommend learning the champion. She seems very, 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 very good. I will say it feels weird seeing her build Shield Bow. I don't expect marksman items this champion, but I believe her optimal build is marksman. Shield Bow, etc. Shield Bow pops at a good time for her. E and whatnot seems to be pretty good champion. She seems very, very strong. I recommend learning her. She seems really cool. Aphelios ultimately gains a bit of attack speed and a bit of lethality. Here is if you're going to max W second or E second. Here is the difference in your attack speed overall. Here's the difference in your physical damage output overall. It appears Emax second is still correct. I didn't verify with data, but the numbers should suggest that. And overall, Aphelios, again, it's a be good at Aphelios kind of problem. So for most people, Aphelios is not the champ for us, and that's okay. Bran takes a pretty meaningful nerf where he loses some passive burn damage and loses some detonate damage as well. Ultimately, here are the numbers. Pretty substantial drop to the burn damage, less of a drop to his detonation, but still a pretty meaningful win rate drop in both support and mid lane. Ends up being an okay support. I think a relatively weak mid laner, but playable if you like playing Bran, so generally okay. Caitlyn gets a early game nerf, well, very early game nerf, mid game buff on Pillar of Peacemaker, and then 90 caliber net. I don't believe it's worth maxing second in any way, but technically is a change here. And so ultimately, Caitlyn is stronger in mana cost and damage on her Q. Pretty quickly on, right? Rank 3 onwards is overall a stronger ability, definitely meaningful. E damage, again, it's going to be 1.1 for a very long time, so you're not going to feel a lot of these changes, but is an increase in the ability. Fizz gets some changes that overall lowered his win rate, from what I could tell. Much less health, a bit nicer mana costs overall. Here is the health change, and then as you can see, it's down to about 4% less health overall. Here is his flat mana pool change, and here is the mana pool change accounting for 4 minutes of mana regen, still up a little bit. But the thing with mana cost changes, or sorry, mana changes overall, is they mean literally nothing until you would run out, which means obviously, you know, once in a while, you will suddenly get 2 extra spells, and that is really, really meaningful. But also, frequently, it does literally nothing for you, which I think tends to make mana cost changes fairly win rate resilient, I guess, where you tend to need bigger swings than I think you need, because it frequently means nothing. And can sometimes be played around. Overall, though, no complaints here. He did lose some win rate, but he's also doing actually pretty well overall, so ended up being fine. Gragas gets an AP ratio buff and a cooldown buff on his barrel roll, as well as a cooldown buff on body slam, which is mostly felt if you don't max it first. Now, tank Gragas tends to be played, well, his best performances pre-patch for Gragas were to max E first and play tank Gragas. That gets walked back a little bit via the fact... sorry, I'm trying to type in to get some data on this patch. I think it's walked back by the fact that E has less of a rank up incentive and there's better ability power ratio on the ability. That said, Emax Gragas is still a relatively higher win rate build, Emax into Q. There's, of course, limited data. Gragas is a popular champion, but early data suggests Emax is still better. And as far as item 1 win rates, tank items are heavily suggested to be far better. So Emax tank Gragas is probably still better. Although Qmax is getting a little bit of a help here, but AP Gragas is still overall the weaker build of the champion. Gwen gets pretty much some strict nerfs. Hollowed Mist gets a lower cooldown incentive. She gets less armor MR inside Hollowed Mist. She gets less refund on skip and slash. Overall, very big nerfs to what is maybe the single best champion in pro play as of MSI. Doing pretty well in the post durability update stuff as well, since he has true damage and percent health damage in the kit. In the same spot, in fact. Obviously pretty meaningful there, so yeah, a bit weaker of a champion. Here is the math on her armor MR difference overall, by the way. It is about, 1 to 5% less durability against champions who actually can hit her inside the mist, which is not a large list of champions, but actually makes her counters stronger counters, since this doesn't do anything unless they were going to be in melee range actually hitting her in the first place. And the cooldown change, again, you're not going to feel until level 14. Irelia gets a bit more healing on her Q and a lower cooldown on Flawless Duet. This is an ability that you max last. It is still going to be the case with the lowered cooldown incentive on ranking it up. So unsurprising here. Yes, it is a lot more healing on her Q overall. That said, getting 2 to 3 health per minion, even if you're last hitting every single minion, is still only about 36 health per minute and is not that much. Yes, it matters. Yes, the numbers are going up, but this is not a huge overbuff. She's not going to be gigantic. Next up is Kayn, who had a bunch of AD ratios that fed into percent health damage. Unsurprisingly, whenever there's more health, percent health damage is very, very good. And so Kayn lost some damage here. Here's the math on how much damage he's dealing with his Q against an average target, which is eventually, 2 to 4% less damage. Once he becomes darkened, obviously, like the first 7 levels, he's not even darkened. So it's more like this. And that's kind of the damage difference to Kayn. There you go. As you said, there were changes to Kog'Maw. He lost some armor MR shred, he lost some passive bonus attack speed, and his Biocrane barrage damage went from 3 to 7 to now actually 3.5 to 6.5. This ends up being, here's the attack speed change, here's the damage amp change, here's the hit damage change, and then this might have been mathed incorrectly here, but ultimately we're still in a boat where he's doing, a less attack speed, less damage. Yeah, more damage per hit overall, but again, going to be doing a bit less damage overall as a champion. Should end up lining up pretty appropriately. Overall, a nerf compared to pre-patch, one of the big winners of the durability update. Lee Sin gets 2 AD and 5 damage on his Q. Obviously, a very big loser with the durability update. This buff definitely useful, though he's still not in the best of spots. Early game champions tend to be nerfed. LPL was played last night, and Kayle was picked in the opening game of the LPL. We're in a meta where Kayle is a viable champion across top teams. Yep, we're definitely in a scaling metagame. Now, I don't believe scaling is the only way to play the game. I think there are still plenty of very strong early game champions. That said, we are playing a lot of scaling. We're going to see a lot more scaling overall in our version of the game, and that's going to probably continue for most of the summer split meta, and might continue on into Worlds. We'll see what happens. Lilia lost some base health and lost some damage on her passive burn, mostly AP ratio based. Ends up being actually a pretty big nerf for the champion overall. Early health nerfs definitely going to be felt quite a little bit. Looking overall at the champion, Lilia lost about 1.5 to 1 3/4% win rate. She is still overall strong. She is a high win rate top laner. She is a relatively high win rate jungler. She is still very much worth playing. She's still a strong champ, but this was a pretty meaningfully aimed nerf and did pretty well. Next up is Master Yi, who lost some health growth and lost some damage rank up on his E. What's going on here is that he lost a lot of win rate. In fact, his overall jungle win rate is just shy of 50% across all elos. Now, ultimately worth pointing out that Master Yi is, if he's like 49.5%, he's clearly a viable champion. If you want to play Master Yi, go play Master Yi. He's going to be fine. But of note, that is what's going on with him. He is a relatively fine champion. Here's the health difference. Here's the just the damage of his E overall, with a rough approximation of how much bonus AD he will buy in a real game and where he kind of ends up on. Next up is Nunu, who actually doing quite well after the patch. Was very low win rate, but this was a very large buff. It is a substantial 6% bonus health to 10% bonus health ratio buff to his Q healing. This brought him to about a 3.5% win rate buff at a 51% overall win rate. The healing against champions is just a percentage of the healing against non-champions, so there's nothing special to look at here. Also, some snowball barrage damage. Snowball Barrage cooldown has a rank up. Again, Nunu is a decent champion. If you like playing Nunu, he's going to be in a pretty good spot. You're going to have fun with that one. Here is the difference in an approximation of how much he'll actually heal, as well as an approximation of, a much closer approximation of what his cooldown on E is going to actually be. And again, seems pretty solid. Olaf, of course, got several changes, right? The threshold for maximum lifesteal / I believe attack speed, that is unverified, so grain of salt with that one. Though the lifesteal was brought down, the under damage was brought up, the cooldown was brought down, Tough Adult cooldown was nerfed in the late game, and then Ragnarok, again, fewer stats in the late game. Overall, though his lifesteal went down, his Q damage went up. And when you can see that the Q damage went up by, 14 to 2%, and the DPS of Q, because of the cooldown refund, goes up by, 35 to 23%, that is more than making up for the 10% armor shred he loses by rank 5 of the ability. And in fact, in rank 1, there was literally no change right here. In rank, this is like a 1% damage drop, this is like a 2% damage drop, this is like a 4% damage drop, and this is a 5% damage drop. And hey, by the way, axe spam does more damage. Olaf still does more damage in this patch than before. Olaf ended up being buffed in the previous patch. Certainly was doing very well. Finally, though, has been tapered down a fair bit and isn't quite so absurd. Still a somewhat weak jungler, a pretty reasonable top laner overall, still worth picking. Overall on the strong side, even with these durability changes to the W as well. Rakan got quite a bit, which is nice because Rakan is a cool guy. Pretty big buffs. He is roughly balanced now in terms of the overall average player base. His win rate is basically smack on 50%, so a well-aimed set of buffs. But Gleaming Quill is up 12 to 25 in healing. Grand Entrance gets a 2-second cut on the cooldown, and Battle Dance gets 15 more shield, as well as a much cheaper mana cost. Again, it's in a pretty good spot. Flat healing increase feels pretty good. W cooldown feels pretty good. Shield and mana cost feels pretty good here as well. Cool, great. Again, relatively balanced champion, definitely very playable. Rengar gets a nerf, and where does he end up? Let me double check the numbers, but Rengar ends up getting hit pretty hard in the jungle, is a relatively playable top laner, but ultimately cooldown on R probably means more for a jungler, though of course level 6 is unchanged, a little bit nerfed at 11, pretty meaningfully nerfed at level 16, and a little bit of base health, which can hurt his early dueling. Overall nerf appeared to affect jungle more than top lane, although it's within room for variance, so not a guarantee to be true. But Rengar is, for most players, no longer OP. And then here is the data table on his health. And then here's the data on his ultimate cooldown. Ryze, as I said, got some big changes. We have the other ones mentioned earlier on in the patch. Ultimately, of course, still a low winner champion, so we're going to move forward from here. Samira gains a lot, and in fact is a relatively strong champion now. I'm excited to play a bunch of Samira this patch because Samira is one of my favorite champions and does really well. Pretty substantial AD growth buff, as well as a lot of extra damage on her Q. This ends up being a like 2% win rate bump, and so Samira is overall a strong champion. As far as her actual performance as a champion overall, she is still more or less an early game pick. She is a bit of a lane bully. Obviously, primary damage comes out of her Q rank up, which, hey, by the way, ends by level 9. And then, yeah, okay, there is an AD ratio buff, don't get me wrong, but again, Q is most of her damage. Q is what you max out first. She is a fairly early game spiking champion, and it's actually why I recommend rushing lethality on her. I recommend Collector first item still. It appears to be by far the correct item to rush on Samira. Slowly but surely, players are adopting this, much like they are adopting Locket Senna, like they are adopting Trinity Force on Viego and Gangplank. We together can help players build the right items. Samira should rush Collector because her entire game plan is snowballing her laning phase, and Collector is the best item in the game to snowball a laning phase. You should buy a Collector. And in fact, even though mathematically in single target DPS, eventually a Lord Dominus Regards will do more damage to you than a Collector on many 3 items builds, especially spell-based 3 item builds. Any champion with high hit rate multi-target abilities, we're talking Sivir W, we're talking Samira Ultimate, we're talking lots of champs like this who have high hit rate multi-target. They have extra special synergy with Collector. The Collector reads, your opponents have 5% less max health. If you are not accounting for that when you're comparing Collector to Lord Dominus Regards, you are basically a faulty analyst. Collector has a unique passive that absolutely must be accounted for when comparing Collector to other items, and it's why the item is incredibly good, despite a lot of the math that we see on the internet saying the item is bad. Because players or people who are posting these numbers are not accounting for the entire item. Collector would lose probably 2% win rate if you deleted the execute off the item, maybe even more than that. There is a reason Collector still performs incredibly well, and I still recommend the item because champions like Samira have a really easy time dealing damage that gets them down to that 5% mark, getting the reset on the E and going ballistic, and it's because, well, she wants to assassinate a squishy and delete the last part of their health. Samira's never 100 to 0ing a big champion anyway. Her damage against a 4-item Darius is irrelevant because she's not the one killing a 4-item Darius. She's the one killing the last half of the health bar on a Varus. She's only killing half his health bar, which means that 5% max health damage amp is actually a 10% max health damage amp because she's only dealing from 50 to 5. Which means she only has to do 45% of his health bar, which is a substantial functional damage amp from that culling strike. So, Collector first item of Samira, very good. Next up, we have Senna. Now, Senna, a little bit harder to look at all the numbers on, but we can do a little bit here. Ultimately, she gains about 2% win rate as a bot laner and loses about 1% win rate as a support. Locket Senna is still exceptional. I'm still going to champion Locket Senna. Locket Senna is still her best build by far. Locket Senna is the truth. Please build that champion in this way. Ultimately, though, gets a very big bump in the number of souls dropped as AD carry. And what's interesting is for the first time in a very long while that I can remember, her average support win rate and average AD carry win rate are within 1% of each other. I remember seeing a Reddit thread about, or at least some comments about Senna overall, and I had a snide reply about like, well, the goal of changes like this is very clear. It's to make support Senna and AD carry Senna relatively similar power levels to make them both viable and neither overbearing. People were like, well, she's been OP at support more than she's been. It's like, I'm talking about goals, not how well they've executed this. This is a way to make AD carry Senna perform reasonably well and make support Senna a bit worse. Support Senna loses under 1% win rate off of this change, even though the change looks pretty big. Ultimately, her power level is not in her Q slow. As an AD carry, gaining a bunch of extra souls ends up being an over 2% win rate gain, and so AD carry Senna is very playable. Support Senna is very playable. If you want to play either version, go for it. She is a true flex pick, and I still think Senna is an incredibly strong champion, and people should play her more, and here we are in a world where Senna is totally playable, and look for it. Overall, here's some math on how much the slow matters. So what this is the overall like potency of the slow expectation-wise as she gains more and more bonus AD. Rough approximation here. This is how much distance an opponent can cover over 2 seconds when hit by a Senna Q. What this ultimately means is as the duration gets cut really heavily in ranks 1 through 8, or levels 1 through 8, obviously the distance covered is substantially higher because they're not slowed for the full duration. Right? An opponent is slowed and moves 17% farther than they would have than after the slow. Ultimately, only about 8% farther after the endgame slow. Not a huge deal at the end of the day, but there you go. Swain gets some nerfs that were, I think, pretty well required. This ends up being about a 1% win rate nerf to support. Keep in mind that the nerf is a little bit heavier in the end game, 7 becoming 6 instead of 5.5 becoming just a flat 5. There's a pretty heavy AP ratio nerf here. There's an AP ratio nerf here as well. Keep in mind rank 1 of the ult is unchanged, so unsurprising that support Swain, who gets less gold and gets fewer levels, unsurprisingly is nerfed less heavily. But top Swain, mid Swain, and bot Swain all lost between 1.5% and 2.5% win rate. Bot Swain, I think, is probably an issue of sample size. There's possibly variance there, or maybe bot Swain really was just nerfed more heavily. I'm unsure. It doesn't make sense to me that bot Swain would get nerfed more than solo lane Swain when support Swain wasn't hurt that heavily, but who knows? It's a possibility. Either way, in every single role, Swain is above 50% win rate as a support, as a mid laner, as a top laner, and as an AD carry. Although mid Swain appears to be his overall strongest role, mid Swain is back. Play mid Swain. It's great. But here's a bunch of numbers on it. Here's the amount of healing he's going to get on average as a champion. Here is the amount of W damage we expect to get out of the ability on average as the champion. And here is how much healing we're going to get out of the R on average. Not down by a ton, but certainly the numbers are there. Next up is Sylas, who got quite a bit. He got several buffs. Mana cost, healing amount, and cooldown on the W, as well as cooldown on the E. Sylas ends up getting about 2% win rate here, which puts him just about balanced, just shy of 50% for the average player, but clearly within playable, 49.5% win rate, about 48.5% win rate in the top lane, although he has some very strong counterpicks, like Sylas is very, very good into Gnar, for example. Uses ultimate really well, and just tends to win the duels very, very strongly. Sylas is a completely pickable champion. And again, cost difference, healing difference, cooldown difference, and E cooldown difference. They're your numbers. Nothing too spicy, but definitely a viable champion. Next up is Tahm Kench, who gains quite a bit as well. He gains a whopping 4% win rate as a top laner and 2.5% win rate as a support when paired with someone like Senna, because, of course, people play bot farm Tahm Kench with Senna support. Unsurprisingly, is a very good champion down there as well, of course, but the sort of base value changes on things like Devour, on Tongue Lash, are going to be useful no matter how much gold you're getting, which means it's a straight buff to support. It's a straight buff to AD carry, who's not even getting that many levels overall, but of course is getting gold, and then the acquired taste bonus damage is pretty meaningful. Again, 4% win rate bump to top lane. He is a very, very strong top laner. About a 2 to 3% win rate bump to bot lane and support. Is an okay support. I hesitate to say is a very good bot laner. Tahm Kench Senna is a very good bot lane, can be said, but he doesn't really have many synergies other than that. People don't tend to play things other than Senna TK down there with him, but at least from that dual lane, is doing really, really well. Here is an expected increase in the passive damage. Here's not kind of missing health, an increase in the Q healing, and then here is an increase in the shield value. All pretty good stuff. Tahm Kench, again, quite good in many roles. Talia loses 20 health, loses some damage, loses some cooldown on Q. Unraveled Earth, a bit better against Jungle Monster, which is cute, and now can't cast R in combat really at all. What this puts Talia at is finally, at least for the average player, in a weak spot in the mid lane, a weak spot in the jungle, and a weak spot at support. Unfortunately, for most players, Talia is, I wouldn't say unplayable, but overall weak. If you're a Talia main, that's great. You'll probably still do pretty well with her, but Talia is not doing the best for most players. She is overall quite weak and probably not worth going for most of us. Here's the health difference. Here is her Q cooldown difference, and then here is the expected Q damage difference. Not a big nerf there, but enough of this all adds up, especially this cooldown change, I think is really, really meaningful, that she isn't doing all that great. One person who is doing all that great is Taric. Taric is doing exceptionally well. Taric gained almost 6% win rate on the patch for average players. This is a very large bump to the amount of healing, a very nice buff to his mana costs, and a very nice bump to the cooldown and stun duration of Dazzle. So here's expected healing out of Taric Q. Here's expected mana cost out of Taric Q. Here is the cooldown difference. It's a flat 2. And then here is a rough approximation, if you aren't getting any resets at all, in the number of stun, the total stun duration per minute of game time on Taric. This is kind of a funky stat, but because there's a stun duration upgrade and a cooldown upgrade, you can kind of apply the two, and it's not entirely fraudulent, and this is a very, very big deal for Taric. Taric is very, very, very good, and if you want to get really, really spicy, Taric is a very, very good jungler as well. Lower mana cost on Q and a lower cooldown on Dazzle is a very big deal for getting to spam and clear the jungle. Data is of course a little bit limited, but Taric jungle appears to be exceptionally strong. Taric top lane appears to be relatively playable. Probably not the best overall top laner. He's not looking great, but he's looking probably playable. And top Taric is okay, and jungle Taric is maybe very, very good. Support Taric is definitely very good. Think about it, good champion. We have Tryndamere, who is getting a bit of extra base healing. This is actually, generally, this is all skewed toward Max Fury and toward rank 5 of the ability, by the way. Undying Rage gets a 10-second flat cooldown change. But ultimately, this gives Tryndamere a lot of win rate. This pushes him back to balanced. Sustain changes actually tend to be more for mid lane, so he actually gained more win rate as a mid laner than he did as a top laner. Interestingly enough, Tryndamere mid appears to be very performant, a very strong champion. Top Tryndamere is roughly balanced. I think Riot did a really good job of targeting almost all these changes where the champions have really, really, for the most part, landed very close to 50% win rate, and that's really exciting. They did a really, really good job with this patch overall from what I've seen so far. We then have Veigar changes. We can actually do the numbers on Tryndamere real quick. Again, the baseline healing with no Fury, not up by a ton, but 20-23%. And then with full Fury, and especially towards rank 5, 14 to 35% in the total heal. Again, matters quite a bit. Ult cooldown down by 10 seconds, matters quite a bit. Champion looks to be in a pretty good spot. Veigar lost about 1% win rate as a mid laner, basically didn't move as a bot laner or support. I mean, this is a pretty small set of changes overall. I believe there's a chance that Veigar support just maxes E outright anyway, and thus doesn't feel this cooldown change nearly as heavily. Though still, obviously is weakers, level 1 through 8, and less armor, levels 1 through 10, I believe are the numbers here. Here is Veigar's armor. Yep, 1 through 10, less armor. And then if you max E second, it's 1 through 12. If you max it first, it's 1 through 8. But, you know, pretty definitively, these are nerfs to Veigar. But small enough they didn't really change his win rate very much. So not a very big deal here. Overall, still a solid mid laner, a good, well, a quite good mid laner, a quite good bot laner, and an okay support is where he is for the average player. Wukong got a 2-second cooldown increase in Warrior Trickster. This is the ability that you max last, so you're not going to feel it too much, or rather, you're not going to feel the like cooldown rank up too much. It's just going to be the flat 2-second difference, basically. A bit of less damage to monsters on Nimbus Strike means he obviously lost more jungle win rate than top win rate. He is still an overall better jungler than he is top laner, and he's overall still quite strong. Worth banning, worth playing, good champion. Here are your numbers on the cooldown change. Again, weaker ability. Xin Zhao gets more healing. Worth pointing out, though, that because the flat healing scales so sharply overall and didn't change, that most of the heavy lifting on this buff is actually in the early game, where his base AD is quite high, over to the base healing, but in late game, it's not that big of a deal. Also, when it becomes lightning, it does more damage and costs less mana. So here's the passive healing. Again, it's a bit front-loaded, even though we are approximating bonus AD in this chart. W thrust damage is up, again, mostly in the early game, and W cost goes down with time. This ends up being also almost a 3% win rate bump to Xin Zhao. He is a slightly weak jungler and a fairly weak top laner, though in a much better state than before. And if we're going to still be in a state here where pros value Xin Zhao over what they value his solo queue win rate, we might see Xin Zhao in the pro meta yet again, if they want to play in an early game focused team composition. And then we have changes to Zeri. And again, some of these changes did get walked back. So this AD ratio is actually 105 to 125. This passive damage, the flat value is the same as before, but instead of 1 to 10 from 1 to 13, it is, I believe, 1 to 13 from levels 1 to 18. So overall, basically, what that means is that we saw the chart earlier for Zeri damage. It is basically flat and then weaker, and then from 5 onwards, the damage is higher. The charge damage is basically going to be flat for a long time, and then around here is going to pick up and do more damage. I realize the numbers are not all here on the paper, and again, that's my fault for working destructively when I first built the rundown out. But ultimately, again, more Q damage, more passive damage, but no passive slow. Okay, very, very relevant. Ultra Shock Laser still does more damage, a bit less slow, a bit lower cooldown, and crits. This is definitely a very big deal. This is a very, very large damage increase. Spark Surge has a cooldown change where this cooldown is actually only down by, I believe, 2 seconds in the real world because it was dropped by 4, but then brought back up by 2. So a 2-second cooldown buff to Spark Surge, but less cooldown reduction. I believe it's cooldown reduction on champion hit, not just on every auto attack, from what I can tell. So you won't always feel this, but definitely less absurd resetting in team fights, but overall more usable in the laning phase. Lightning Crash, pretty meaningfully lower cooldown. In my playing Zeri this patch, have really felt the cooldown change. And so even though she's getting less infinite stacking in a team fight, gets more stacks early on. Ultimately, the end result of this, and by the way, the W damage through walls is massive. She is really, really, really scary. This is a very big ability. This really does a lot of damage. And so even though the slows are changed, the cooldowns change, all this stuff, a bunch of numbers, what it comes down to is Zeri went from being absurdly busted after these changes to being brought down by the micropatch to being a relatively solid champion. I believe for the average player, she is slightly weak, but if you are a Zeri player, you will do just fine with Zeri. You will enjoy playing her. She is a roughly balanced champion in the hands of the average player. So if you want to play her, go for it. But not worth hard going after. Now, the other big set of changes are to Grievous Wounds, and my overall take is that Grievous Wounds items were buffed in this patch, and overall you should be more willing to buy Grievous Wounds on your champion. Now, they're going to shut down healers by less, as they are reducing healing by less than before, so a healer is still getting 75% or 6% of their healing, no matter how much Grievous is being applied. Of course, this also will directly nerf champions like Singed and Katarina, who apply Grievous. Kled Q directly applies Grievous. Ignite directly applies Grievous. Those are all going down. But Bel'Veth does more damage to the attacker. Thornmail has a bigger bonus armor ratio. But here's this part that's really exciting. Extra Calling gets 5 AD. More reminder. Okay, just stacks more quickly, whatever. Kench Chainsword gets 10 AD, 10 haste. Oblivion Orb gets 5 AP. Lenomicon gets 10 AP and 50 health. And Kevin Beautifier gets 5 AP. So let's talk about what's going on here. Well, here is our set of numbers. Basically, what I want to call your attention to are these numbers here that I am highlighting. So what these numbers indicate is the theoretical gold cost of 100% healing reduction. Now, I think that is a reasonable thing to talk about, because what are you doing when you're buying these items? When you're buying these items, you are maximizing damage to the enemy health bar. Grievous Wounds is functionally true damage that triggers when an enemy heals. So if you have 1,000 damage outgoing, and you want to make that 1,100 damage outgoing, you can either increase your AP such that you have 100 more base damage, functionally. You can increase your magic pen such that you do 10% more damage, or you can cut their healing such that they are receiving 100 less healing. These are all functionally the same thing. You are achieving the same goal, which is the health bar is lower because of the items that I bought. That is going to be sort of true. That's what you're targeting with these kinds of things. And so when you think about it, if I'm fighting Soraka, and Soraka's going to give someone 500 health. Okay, they're going to give them 500 health. Well, if I spend, the equivalent of 688 gold with Old Executioners, I can cut their health by 500, right? 688 for 100% Grievous Wounds. The equivalent of that expenditure is that. And of course, and by the way, I'm comparing to old 12.9 pre-durability update on the items, okay? Before any of the other little small changes, before they got cut down a little bit and then cut down again. Now it only costs 400 gold for 100% Grievous Wounds, which means I am paying less for my healing cut. I am paying less for healing cut than I was before on Executioner's Calling. Kench Chainsword, right? I guess got a 17 gold discount rebate on my, getting my Hackshore unique passive, but Kench Chainsword is fighting with Guardian Angel and Death's Dance and Maw, and, you're getting gold-efficient attack damage, haste, health, and whatever, and, 400 gold worth of Grievous Wounds. Okay? Now, you're getting 600 extra gold worth of stats, and still getting a solid amount, 300, 250 gold worth of Grievous Wounds. So this is overall a much, much, much stronger item, right? If we're going to consider 688, right? If it's 688, we go something like this. right? Okay, well, I'm getting, 140 less gold worth of Grievous Wounds. Okay, but I'm getting 600 extra gold worth of stats. Kench Chainsword should be bought way more than before. This item is incredibly powerful, and more players should just be buying Chainsword because this item is very, very, very good. Old Oblivion Orb, again, you were paying, 370 gold for 100% Grievous Wounds, basically. That was the prorated number. You are paying even less for the Grievous Wounds now, getting buffed by 5 AP. It is a pretty big discount. You're only, you are paying 40 gold for the unique passive instead of paying 150 gold for the unique passive. And by the way, the unique passive is still about 60% as good as the old one, but discounted very heavily. Oblivion Orb is an overall better item. We look at Morellonomicon. Morellonomicon, you're paying 150 gold for the unique passive, and now you're getting paid 250 for the unique passive. And the unique passive is still 2/3 as good. Morellonomicon was strictly buffed. And what's interesting is, okay, before, you're getting 20% Grievous Wounds, and now you're only getting another 15% Grievous Wounds. Sure, you're cutting that incoming healing by a lower number. However, you're getting 2,000 gold worth of stats and 15 Grievous Wounds for 1,700 gold. That's really good. Before, right, you were getting 1,800 gold. Not even that, 1,750 gold. 1,750, not 2,000 worth of stats, right? So, 250 gold difference. And then also, still, the price point here, not bad overall. Morellonomicon, pretty worth buying. So these items, I would say, overall got a little bit buffed in efficiency. These items actually, I believe, got stronger, and more players should build Morellonomicon, more players should build Kench Chainsword, and more players should be willing to sit on Executioner's Calling because it is a very, very good item. Tech Putrefier got much less of a buff. It's only 5 AP. To be fair, Putrefier was the best Grievous Wounds item by far. You are still, getting all of your stats for free, basically. But Puffcap Toxin was nerfed pretty substantially, and that's definitely pretty meaningful. So this item, I think, is a little bit more flat because the compensation is not nearly as incredible. The final things we care about, 10 more AP on Crown of the Shadow Queen, 10 less AP on Riftmaker, 10 more haste on Night Harvester, a bit less damage on Leandries, a bit less root on Everfrost. Some reshuffling around, to be sure. Riftmaker nerfs definitely does nerf Riftmaker champions. KO gets a bit weaker, things like that. That all certainly matters and whatnot. But overall, nothing too spicy to look at here. Just, some rebalancing on Mage Mythics, and that's just fine. We have pretty meaningful buffs to tank Mythics, though. Again, no data table on this, but worth pointing out that Balmy Cinder is 100 gold cheaper. Frostfire, Sunfire, and Chem Tank are all the same total cost, but with a better component that is a buff to the items. They also all gained an extra 100 bonus health, which is pretty meaningful as well. Unsurprisingly, tanks were the losers of the durability update, which I called in the previous patch rundown. That has still been true, and so tank mythics are stronger, and congratulations. This means that Gragas got 2 buffs. He got a Q cooldown buff, he got 3. He got an early game E cooldown buff, and these items got stronger. Hey, by the way, Gragas should still be building all the way tank. Abyssal Mask also worth considering. Knight's Vow a bit better, Randu's Omen a bit better, Spirit Visage a bit better, and Zeke's a bit better. Again, a bunch of tank items got buffed. Some underperforming tank items are a bit more usable. Congratulations. Up to 15 extra MR, by the way, on Abyssal Mask. Really, really, really worth considering. The one weird part is going to be in tank junglers. Can they find a way to get a full 1,000 gold for their first recall? It is much more expensive than a pickaxe. It is meaningfully more expensive than cooldown boots. Probably requires some lane taxing, but interesting thought all the same. Some nerfs, some buffs to fighter items. Rune King buffed back to 8%. Ma nerfed, Sterix buffed, Gore Drinker buffed, and Death's Dance slightly nerfed. I think a very intelligent fighter item follow-up. Good choices to make there. Sterix, I looked at early data on day 1 or 2 of the patch. Sterix did not seem to be performing incredibly well, although early data indicated it was probably an okay item, and at least worth considering as an item pickup. With Ma getting directly nerfed and Sterix getting directly buffed, it should really be considered because, hey, it is more damage, it is a better shield, this can matter. I don't think there's going to be a big surge of Sterix abusers, but yes, a better item, and at least worth considering, is all I'm really going to say here. Kraken Slayer, less damage overall. Umbral Glaive, bit longer cooldown. Again, just a lot of sort of small follow-up stuff. Kraken Slayer, unsurprisingly, doing better when there's more armor in the game. The big one is this turret change here. So what it comes down to is, here is this number right up here. 13.5% is, if you're looking at a squishy, look at a Samira, look at, a Senna who's not building Locket. Basically, if you're not building health, armor, MR in your items, you are getting 13 to 25% more durable via the durability update, okay? That's the change. Now, the more tank items you normally bought, Death's Dance, Steel Caps, Locket, Stone Plate, Gore Drinker, the more durability you buy, the lower this number actually goes. And it's, 11 to 19%, 15%, whatever. The more tankies. And it's why, again, tanks did worse in the patch, because tanks only bought tank items. Fighters went kind of hybrid. And so, for example, a fighter going for a Death's Dance doesn't discount their health bonus. They only discount their armor bonus and only buy a little bit. Whereas a tank who's buying a Randuin's or a Sunfire or a just pick your tank item, right? All those things have health on it. Health gets discounted. Fighter items have a bit less health than tank items do. They were doing a bit worse, while the tank items got buffed, right? Okay, moving forward though. This is patch to patch. The damage of the outer turrets, it is down 3 to 12%. Okay, the important one though is 12.9 to 12.11. It is still up 7 to 24%. And remember, champions were buffed 13 to 25%. Okay, so it's... And keep in mind, right, the first few levels here, right, this is levels 1 through, oh, right, we can't do it that way. Right, these kind of don't matter. We can actually do, that doesn't matter. Just pretend it doesn't exist, right? We can hide the rows, I suppose. Do something like this. Hey, guess what, right? In the first 5 minutes of the game, no one's taking tower damage, right? Who's taking tower damage at 4 minutes in, except a really, really, really awkward dive? Right? If you're doing a level 6 tower dive on a top laner, it's this or this is the number, right? Huh. So this 17 to 24% sure looks real close to 13 to 25%, doesn't it? But wait, there's more. Again, remember, people who bought tank items aren't getting the full 1325. Also, turrets have 30% armor penetration. So the 0 to 10% durability they got from bonus armor is actually cut down by about 15% or 3 percentage points, 2 percentage points, something like that. Which means they're actually only 13 to 23% more durable before buying armor items, and then it's still, or health items, still less than that. So turrets definitively, in the average case, are more lethal than 12.9. That is true. Turrets are more lethal than in 12.9. That's the numbers. Alrighty. That is the patch rundown in about half the time my first version, because I didn't spend nearly as much time going on rants and whatnot, and hopefully it was still enjoyable. Now, 12.11 is a very, very large patch, and we should TLDR it in hopefully 15 minutes or less. Let's try. All right, first things first, Kog'Maw got way over nerfed and got micropatched back up. He's roughly balanced now. Olaf got intended to be nerfed. He was buffed, and so they micropatch nerfed him. This ends up being about a 5% damage dealt decrease from level 9 onwards, and obviously a meaningfully smaller shield puts Olaf at a relatively strong but roughly balanced spot in top lane, and a relatively balanced but roughly weak spot in the jungle. Ryze gets a micropatch buff after the buffs in the patch itself. A little bit of cooldown on Q, a very substantial damage increase on the E, which only means so much. Ryze is still overall weak for solo Q. Zeri got substantially overbuffed in the patch, and so they walked back some buffs on Q damage, they walked back some buffs on Q passive damage, and they walked back some buffs on Spark Surge cooldown. Ultimately, Zeri lands in a roughly balanced spot for most players. If you're good at Zeri, you'll still be successful. If you're a bandwagoner, hop off the champion. She's not for you anymore. That's okay. Roughly balanced for Zeri. Bel'Veth's out. I think she's going to turn out OP. She's doing relatively well on day 1 of the patch. That will only climb. Bel'Veth, if you learn the champion, is probably free low. Aphelios is weak for the average player, still gets about a 3 to 4% damage amp across maxing either of these abilities. So a late game damage amp of almost, 6 to 9%. Ultimately, still weak for the average player, though obviously if you're a good Aphelios player, you should do pretty well with this one. Brand gets nerfed pretty heavily and isn't doing the best anymore. Overall, losing quite a bit of damage. Is still strong. He was OP in the previous patch because he has a bunch of percent damage in a world where people gained a bunch of bonus health. He is still a very strong support and still a very strong mid laner, just a bit less overbearing. Caitlyn, we can look at her, and is overall still weak for the average player. Early game lane blow is still not quite enough, and this is just not a big enough damage. Still, it's higher damage from level 5 onward, and a lower mana cost from level 5 onwards. It is a stronger champion, but Caitlyn is still not in a great spot for the average solo queue player. Fizz also not doing all that well anymore. 1 second, as I find the fact that he was a bit OP. Now he is roughly balanced for the average player. Lost some health, gained some mana. For the average player, this ended up being a bit of a nerf, though Fizz is still a completely playable champion. Arguably slightly on the strong side, though not by a ton, but a completely reasonable champion to play. Even after all the mage item changes that are in his patch as well, farther down below, still a very solid champion. Gragas is doing just fine. If you play tank Gragas, you are going to do very, very, very well. Jungle Gragas actually gained a lot because a cooldown change means a ton for clear speed. So Jungle Gragas is super back. For the average player, he's not incredible, but we probably see Gragas in pro play. If you want to play Gragas in the top lane, and probably for jungle, mid, whatever as well, tank Gragas appears to be the best version of Gragas, and tank Gragas is totally, actually very good. Totally play this champion. He's looking pretty tasty. AP Gragas, not the best, but whatever. Gwen gets hit pretty hard here, was a big pro play staple, loses about 3% win rate off of this change. Quite meaningful, to be clear. Definitely matters quite a bit. I'm sorry for most of the Gwen players out there. Kinda Ryze tier in solo queue unless you're an excellent Gwen player or Ryze player. Probably kicks her most of the way out of pro play. Unfortunately, Gwen has been a huge pro play balance problem. Irelia gains a little bit here as well, was doing not too well pre-patch, buffed up to relative viability, just a hair below 50% win rate in both top lane and mid lane for the average player. Overall solid champion, you still max E last, champ seems fine. Next up is Kayn, who gets a pretty big hit to red form damage. Of course, does not affect blue Kayn in any way, but this is a damage nerf to red Kayn. He will feel this. It's, 5% less damage or so on his Q by endgame, and yeah, that matters. Next up, Kog'Maw. As I mentioned earlier, there was a micropatch to Kog'Maw. He ended up being heavily over-nerfed, so it got walked back a little bit. Kog'Maw ends up, I think, in a slightly strong position. He lost attack speed. He lost some shred. The overall change to Hurricane Barrage, 3 to 7 becomes 3.5 to 6.5, so a little bit better early, a little bit worse late, but accounting for the Q changes, overall does less damage, period, as a champion. Kog'Maw is an overall slightly strong pick for the average player in solo queue, and he's probably pro viable. Lee Sin gets a much needed buff because he certainly was not doing well once early game was functionally nerfed. He gains a lot of win rate, but is still, for the average player, and basically Ryze tier. Do not play Lee Sin unless you are a complete Lee Sin expert. Just don't do it. Ryze would probably be a better option for the average player. Like, Lee Sin is sadly dead for most of us mere mortals right now in the game. Lilia is in a spot right now where she's still pretty strong, actually. She is a very, very strong top. She was a incredibly overbearing top laner and is now just a strong top laner. She was a way too good jungler and is now just a strong jungler, but she is still very good in both roles. I think still incredibly OP as a top laner. Absolutely still a great source of MMR if you want to win a bunch of games. Lilia is great in a longer duration fights, stack up, high health kind of environment, which is what we are in. The game really rewards Lilia's kit. Lilia's kit is very successful. Great champion. Master Yi was nerfed very, very heavily. Now, was quite OP. Nerfed to, for the average player, relative balance. I looked up a bit of data real quick because I'm curious about something. Pre-patch Emax Master Yi was actually his best build. By far, it wasn't close. And I think as Elo rose, players kind of started to learn that. The pick rate, I believe, was higher in Diamond compared to like Gold or whatever, or Silver. That has been brought down to relative parity. Emax and QMax Master Yi are about the same power level. If you weren't playing Emax Master Yi in the previous patch, you missed out on Freelo. It was dumb good. Now it's just about as good as QMax. Either of those builds is fine, I guess. Again, for the average player, he is roughly balanced. He is fine. So if you're a big Master Yi player, he is still a completely playable champion. He is not dog shit. He is not OP. He is not horrible. He is a balanced champion. congratulations. Master Yi is a relatively balanced champion. If you like playing him, play him. And that's all I can really say here. Meanwhile, Nunu and Willump gained a bunch. Nunu is obviously a bit of a particular champion, right? He's kind of a unique playstyle. If you're a good Nunu player, he's going to be outstanding for you. For the average player, he is actually doing pretty well. This was a very big buff, increasing the AP ratio and healing on his Q. I'm pretty confident the proper Nunu build is still just full tank. His highest win rate items are definitely still tank items. Riftmaker, Rocket Belt are much lower win rate than Sunfire or Iceborne. But if you want to play AP, I guess you could, but Tank Nunu is the better Nunu. And he is very good with a cooldown change on E and a heal buff on Consume. He is really strong. If you're a good Nunu player, play him. Now, if you're a bandwagoner, it will take you time to learn Nunu. He is deceptively a hard-to-play champion because his playstyle is so unique. Much like Yuumi, much like Singed, much like Udyr. These are champions who are not mechanically hard to play. They are not Yasuo. They are not Ahri. They are not... I mean, Zoe's not the most mechanical. This is not Akali. This is not Yone. This is not... I would argue Samira to a certain degree. Vayne, whatnot. These are intellectually challenging champions. They don't play like other champions. There is no, well, I'll take the fight and then out-mechanic you. It's, you need to know before the fight starts, is it a good fight? Because these are champions that do not out-mechanic the other champs. They're not. They don't do that, right? Nunu is, if I identify the gank literally always works. You can't slow me out of it. You could try to stun me, but the snowball still moves forward. If I ID the gank, I am going to kill you. IDing ganks is a skill. It is not a mechanical skill. It is a skill. IDing Nunu ganks is a Nunu-specific skill. Learning Nunu is rewarding. He is a good champion, but you do need to learn the champion. So if you're on a bandwagon, stay on it for a while, learn your part, memorize the sheet music. That's kind of the play here. But yes, actually a good champion now. If you want to learn Nunu, you will be well rewarded. Next up is Olaf, who got a big set of changes. Overall, less healing through the passive, but a damage and cooldown buff to Undertow, a trivial cooldown nerf to Tough It Out, a trivial durability nerf to Ragnarok, and Olaf ended up being a incredibly strong champion. Now, he has been micropatched. Again, less armor shred on the Q, less shielding on the W. The end result appears to be that he is... the top lane versus jungle performance has been closed somewhat, but basically jungle overall with these changes I think went down very slightly, and top went down a bit more. Olaf is still a very good top laner and a not great jungler, though playable in jungle is not great, but playable, and still a very strong top laner, totally worth playing, is a good champion. Rakan gained a lot and is doing really well in this patch, almost exactly 50% win rate. These buffs were about 3% win rate positive when, unsurprisingly, each one of these changes were about a 1% win rate change. This is probably a bit less so. This is probably more like a 1% win rate change. This is like a 1.5. This is like a 0.5. But yeah, Rakan gained almost exactly 3% win rate on the patch and is a completely viable champion. Rakan is a cool bro. Go ahead and play Rakan. Rengar lost a little bit here. Definitely on the weak side for most of his roles. Okay top laner, not a great jungler overall, but yeah, nerfed Rengar, that's where he is. Ryze is the other half of the changes from the patch itself. Again, gained lower mana costs and more damage on his E. Again, the E damage cost was increased even more. The E damage was increased even more on the micropatch. Unfortunately, it's still Ryze for us mortals. Still not that good of a champion, so probably still skip this one. Samira, however, is in a very good spot. Samira looks really strong. Please, if you want to win on Samira, go rush a Collector. She is still an early game snowball champion, and she has a ton of multi-hit and a ton of target access, which means she can get the Collector executes very reliably. Seriously, Collector rush on Samira is very pog. You should do it. It's amazing. Gain about 2% win rate on the patch. If you play Collector Samira, you will be stomping people. This is an amazing build. You should play it. Senna gets brought down in support with less slowing on her Q, and brought up as an AD carry with more misdrops from minions that she kills. Ultimately, the win rate of support Samira and AD carry Samira are very very close in win rate. They're within 1% of each other. Senna is a true flex pick. You can play either one, although I am still going to shill for Locket Senna as a very OP build. Please, if you like MMR, play Locket Senna. It's dumb good. Swain, too good and still too good. Loses some healing on the passive, loses some damage on W, loses some healing on the ultimate, although not quite as much in rank 1. Ultimately, support Swain was nerfed the least of his roles, but he is played in all 3 non-jungle farming roles and is very good in all 3 performing roles there. He is overall a very strong champion, about 52% win rate everywhere, 51, 52% everywhere. Very, very strong champion. Not exceedingly OP, but if you like Swain, you are rewarded for playing Swain. Swain is a good champion. Enjoy. Also, just kind of fun note, mid Swain is actually his highest performing role. I do want to give huge commendations to the designer who did the Swain mid-scope update, because we are in a world where mid Swain is the objectively best performing Swain. So all the mid laners out there who are like, I want my Swain back. Swain is back. You have your Swain. Enjoy. He is good and a primary mid laner. Get on it. Sylas gets some pretty decent-sized buffs to his W. Ultimately, it's about a 2% win rate bump off of mana cost, healing, cooldown, and more cooldown. Obviously, these changes are pretty small, 1 to 0 seconds. A small AP ratio buff on the heal, just 10 mana cost here, just 1 second here, right? These aren't big changes individually, but amounts to about a 2% win rate bump. And Sylas is a completely playable mid laner, an okay-ish top laner, mostly for counter picks, though. And yeah, totally back in the menu for us mortals in solo queue. Tahm Kench gains a lot of power off of 3 pretty big sets of changes here. Tongue Lash healing, acquired taste damage applies to his passive auto attacks and his Q damage, and some bumped up Devour shield strength, even though the ult scaling is, 2/3 value at rank 1, which is obviously feels a little absurd. That is how you make a support win rate playable. His support win rate is still much, much lower than his top lane win rate, though clearly playable for a lot of people in pro play. Tahm Kench Senna is obviously a quite strong duo and remains to be the case. Tahm Kench Senna is definitely quite great, but Tahm Kench support is playable. Not outstanding, but playable. And Tahm Kench top is very, very, very good. Was buffed more than Tahm Kench support, which doesn't surprise me when you gave a bonus health ratio on a bunch of damage. So if they wanted to walk back a little bit and keep the support buffs without getting so many top lane buffs, they could have walked this one down back to like 3% bonus health, and he would be relatively balanced. But Tahm Kench, right now, very strong top laner. If you want some free wins at a top lane, I wouldn't say free wins, but like heavily favored wins at a top lane, he's going to look really, really good there. He is an early game champion, a bit of a lane bully, a bit of a mid game power spike, because, I mean, he only really has one ability worth ranking, so of course he kind of falls off, but looks pretty good. Definitely a strong top laner, just an early game skewed one. Talia gets nerfed really, really hard. Unfortunately, for most of us here, not going to be worth picking for mid or jungle anymore. I will say, though, Talia is really elite skewed. Talia, a lot of her win rate is in high elo, in high MMR. So I'm going to look at some data real quick. Across all ranks, Talia's mid lane win rate is 47.5%. Across the top 5% of the player base, or 10% of the player base, her mid lane win rate is 49.3%. Well, okay, let's call it actually 48 and change. But yeah, Talia is more performant in higher ranks than in lower ones. This nerf did appear to affect higher ranks more than lower ones, so this did skew her towards a bit flatter. Either way, for most players is not a highly performing champion. For most of us, we probably shouldn't be playing Talia, but a pretty big set of changes: less health, worse cooldown, worse damage. A bit more E damage to monster, which is kind of nice. So, her jungle win rate gets a little bit nicer. But these nerfs overtake that, and she's still an overall quite weak jungler, and just not quite there for most of us in the mid lane either. Taric gets a massive set of buffs and looks really, really good after the changes. Overall, one of the strongest champions on the patch right now. A big bump to the healing, a big buff to the mana cost ratio, big bump to the cooldown, and big bump to the stun duration. Taric support is actually one of the easiest to play champions in the game. He has a very, very flat mastery curve. As long as Taric suits you playstyle-wise, you will pick him up very quickly. He's relatively simple to play. Doesn't have a lot of the same mechanical difficulties or difficult to understand situations going on. That stunn's not that hard to intuit. And yeah, overall, very strong champion. Very much worth picking up. Good champ overall. Tryndamere always has been a bit of a lane bully. Pretty substantial buffs to his early game. Mostly his healing is up and mostly skewed towards rank 5 of the ability. as well as Undying Rage getting a 10-second flat cooldown reduction here. Tryndamere gets buffed up to pretty much exactly balanced, a pretty large buff overall, because it is a lot of extra healing, makes him survive a lot more lanes, but it appears as though Trynd mid may in fact be his best role, because you can drain tank through all the mages and then still threaten some all-ins. Even though the lane is short and running people down can be hard, he has very, very good wave clear, very good roaming, and is very resilient to poke, and so Trynd mid is probably the secret tech of the patch right now. Trynd mid looks to be pretty good. He's not incredibly OP, but Trynd mid is strong. Trynd top is playable. Trynd jungle, and not really quite there, unfortunately, but that's okay. Veigar gets some very, very small touches here. Support Veigar's going to max E first, who will barely feel this by level 9. Armor changes are very, very slight. This doesn't change him much at all either. Ultimately, Veigar is still quite strong in all of his farming roles. He's not the best support ever. There actually just are better stun bots out there for support. I know it's like a fun mage to play, but there are better mages and there are better CC champions. So Veigar support, not really a great thing. But yeah, Veigar bot and Veigar mid, both quite good. Still totally playable. Wukong loses 2 seconds on his cooldown on W and a bit of damage to monsters, which is a nerf to Wukong. He is definitely weaker, but he is overall still a very strong jungler, one of the very best junglers on the patch. And if you are a Wukong player, you can still be a Wukong player. He is really, really, really good. Xin Zhao gains a lot of power on the patch. Overall, a bit more healing on the passive. Actually, yeah, a bit more skewed toward the early game. W damage also increased. Actually a bit more skewed toward the early game as well. The 10 flat damage increase tends to skew pretty heavily towards rank 1 through 5. The 80 ratio bump is not so big that it really matters that much. And so the power spike is really around level 9 here in this champion. He is a relatively playable jungler. He is not outstanding, but he is completely fine. He is, for, you know, the average player, is totally reasonable. 4 to 9% win rate basically. Again, not OP, not meta defining. I wouldn't put him, S tier or anything, but like if you want to play Xin Zhao, go play Xin Zhao. Zeri got a big set of changes. These changes by themselves were way too much. She was very overpowered, maybe the single best champion on the patch. She was micropatch nerfed down to rough balance. Again, if you're a Zeri bandwagoner, feel free to hop off. If you like Zeri, she'll reward you. She's a relatively balanced champion. We may see her a lot in pro play as a result. We'll see, but just, another update on a Zeri to try to get in her spot where she's not overtaking pro and not overtaking everything with Triforce builds. My TLDR on the Grievous Wounds changes is that they all got a lot more efficient, even though the amount of Grievous Wounds has been cut down from 30 to 25 and 50 to 40. These items are actually, I would argue, stronger items than they were in 12.9. The overall stat increases to these items, getting 5 AD, 10 AD and 10 haste, 5 AP, 10 AP and 10 and 100 HP. Really, really, really substantial buffs. I think these items were overall stronger than they were in 12.9 and should be bought in a higher percentage of games than they were in 12.9. These items look very, very good and should definitely be bought. Mage items, a few of them. So Shatter Queen gained 10 AP, Rivemaker lost 10 AP, Night Harvester gained 10 haste, Landry's lost 10 burn, and Everfrost lost a half second on its root duration. Overall, not absolutely huge changes here, but shuffling around the best and worst performing mage mythics seems okay here. Tanks were the big losers of the durability update, which I called in my previous patch rundown. Balmy Cinder is 100 gold cheaper. That cost is then paid back in combined cost, but 100 more health on Frostfire, Sunfire, and Chem Tank. Abyssal Mask gains 5 to 15 more MR. Knight's Vow gains 10 haste. Randwinds gains 10 armor. Visage gains 10 MR. And Zeke's gains 10 armor. All of which are pretty meaningful buffs and should buff the tank class overall. As mentioned earlier, Tank Gragas, a big winner of this patch. His items and his champion got buffed and looks pretty good. Meanwhile, fighter items, some reshuffling. Goredrinker, a small buff. Sterix, a medium-sized buff. While Ma and Death's Dance got nerfed, and Rukin gets a bit of its lifesteal back. Overall, I think good to try to close the gap on Ma and Sterix. I think overall good to nerf Death's Dance. Good changes here. Seems pretty smart. Kraken Slayer losing some of its bonus damage as well. 10 flat as well as 5% bonus AD, which by the way, the item itself rolls in. So it's, a bit more than 10 damage off in the initial place. I'll Glaive nerf a little bit here as well. And the final thing to point out is the turret damage change. So turrets, the TLDR is they do less damage than in 12.10. Of course, not a surprise here. The other part, though, is that turrets overall do more... Well, turrets overall kill enemy champions, on average, a little bit faster in 12.11 than they did in 12.9. Ultimately, the TLDR is after the durability update and after this change, turrets are a little bit more lethal than they were before the update. Not by a large amount, but they are a little bit more lethal. That's it for the patch. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. See you next time. Bye-bye.